In the second lesson of Unit 8, we will take a look at energy flow through ecosystems. We have three basic learning objectives for this lesson. First, we want to be able to describe the strategies organisms use to acquire energy and use energy. Secondly, we want to be able to explain how the activities of autotrophs and heterotrophs enable the flow of energy within an ecosystem. And then explain how changes in energy availability affect populations and ecosystems. Let's first touch on energy balance and metabolic rate. So metabolic rate, or your metabolism, is basically the amount of energy used during a given period of time to power your chemical reactions or your metabolic reactions within your body. Now, because these are chemical reactions, they are subject to thermodynamics, specifically the first two laws of thermodynamics. And the first law will tell us that energy can neither be created nor destroyed, only converted from one form to another. So this means that when an organism, such as yourself, requires energy, it must have a source of energy from outside its living system or its organism. So this is why, as humans, for example, we need to eat. So the breakdown of organic molecules in our food frees energy to be transferred to bonds in ATP. So this is where we go back to cellular respiration. When you guys have a source of glucose, you will go through glycolysis, which in the absence of oxygen will liberate 2 molecules of ATP for every glucose molecule. And then if oxygen is present, the prep reactions will take the products of glycolysis and enter them into the mitochondria, which then is able to make a lot more energy as a result of the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis of ATP, making like 38 ATP. So again, that goes back to the discussions we had on cellular respiration. Now, the other thing that we need to realize is the second law of thermodynamics also comes into play here, which says that any energy conversion is not 100% efficient. So that includes the energy that you get out of your food. Not all the energy and the calories you consume from a meal are used to do work. In fact, an awful lot of it is used to generate heat, which gives you your warm body temperature, right? Humans maintain an internal core body temperature of around 37 degrees Celsius or 98 degrees Fahrenheit. So a majority of our calories go into creating that heat. And this body heat dissipates into the environment in an unusable form, meaning you cannot harvest your body heat and turn it back into a meal for you to consume later. So this is an important law of to understand about living organisms and even ecosystems as a whole, is that whereas we can recycle nutrients like carbon and water can recycle through ecosystems, energy can't. It flows in one direction. And so we'll see that brought out in this lecture, and that all has to do with the first and second law of thermodynamics. Now, basal metabolic rate is basically what your metabolic rate, the status of your chemical reactions and the pace of your chemical reactions at a resting state. So it could also be looked at as your resting metabolic rate. And we define this as the metabolic cost of living. So just simply existing requires energy. And so your basal metabolic rate is your resting metabolic rate. Now there's two general strategies organisms will use for delivering the energy needed to be alive. Some organisms are what we call endotherms. So they generate their own body heat. So they maintain a high body temperature by generating heat from their caloric intake, right? So this would be humans. Humans have a core body temperature of 37 degrees, which is very similar to what you see here on the graphic, on this graph here. We see this rabbit here is maintaining a core body temperature around 37 degrees. No matter what the environmental temperature is, right? So the x-axis is the environmental temperature, so 0 degrees would be a freezing winter day, 40 degrees would be a very, very hot summer day. And so the body temperature, notice, of the rabbit is pretty much consistent throughout that point. So the metabolism of the rabbit is maintaining that core body temperature. Now, what's the advantage of this? Well, the advantage for endotherms is this ensures that chemical reactions are always at optimal levels at any given time. So there's no warm-up period. They are ready to respond to their environment very, very quickly. But the cost is that they must consume a lot of food because there is this food-induced thermogenesis, meaning they are generating heat from the calories they consume. Now, the other strategy we see here is ectotherms, where body temperature changes with the environment. And so we can see that here with this iguana, right? So notice how the body temperature changes, right, with the environmental temperature. So environmental temperature on a cold day, nearly freezing, we can see that the body temperature of the iguana is also very cold. And of course, this is why in Florida, if we get very, very cold days, iguanas are famous for just falling out of the trees, right? Because their basal metabolic rate drops to such a level they become inactive and their body kind of just shuts down. They don't necessarily die, they just don't have the energy to maintain their posture in trees, and so they fall. Whereas when the environmental temperature gets warm, the iguana becomes much more active. Their body temperature, core body temperature, is being raised. Now their chemical reactions will proceed in a very, very fast pace, and they can kind of carry on with life. One interesting example of this, of an ectotherm similar to the iguana, is a very interesting species called the Jesus Christ lizard, which gets its name because it can run across water. Well, it can't do that unless it warms itself first. So what it will do behaviorally is it will bask on a sunny rock and get its body temperature nice and warm. And then once it's warm, it's able to run much faster than if its body was cold. And so it can run so fast that it can skip across the surface of the water. Now, your basal metabolic rate has an interesting relationship with mass. Well, at least maybe not yours. I should say the basal metabolic rate of species. The amount of energy expended per gram of body mass is in a resting condition is known as the mass-specific basal metabolic rate. And what's interesting about this is there is a definite relationship we see between the size of an organism, meaning its body mass, and its relative mass-specific basal metabolic rate. It's an exponential curve and an inverse relationship, basically telling us that smaller organisms, such as the shrew here and the mouse and the kangaroo mouse, right, really small mammals, have a much higher basal metabolic rate. When we compare that then to, if we compare that to an elephant or a horse, even a human, our metabolic rates are much slower because we're larger organisms. So generally, the smaller the organism, the higher the basal metabolic rate. Now, notice in this section, we're also, in addition to metabolic rate, we're talking about energy balance. And so there must be a balance, according to the laws of thermodynamics, that has to do with maintaining energy appropriately. So body weight in an organism, specifically mammals and such, will remain stable when the amount of energy consumed equals the energy expended. So calories in from your food must equal calories out from your exercise and your basal metabolic rate. So a net gain in energy results in energy storage or the growth of an organism. So when you're young, you consume a lot of calories. So a lot of you are still growing teenagers, and so you probably notice that you can eat, especially athletes can eat very large meals and not have to worry so much about weight gain. Why is that? Because your basal metabolic rate is very high. You're burning calories just sitting there listening to this lecture at a higher rate than, say, somebody older. And you're also going out and exercising a lot, whether or not it's through training or playing a game, whatever it might be, you're burning lots of calories. And so your body is demanding lots of calories. And usually you have a balance and you don't gain weight, right? But as you get older, your basal metabolic rate tends to slow down. We tend to become less active because we're working and not having as much time for play, and our body simply isn't growing. And so our caloric requirements tend to go down. But if we don't respond by consuming less, well, then we have a net gain. Well, when you're older, if you have a net gain in energy storage, that is where you start to deposit adipose tissue or fat, right? So now in the wild, fat is wonderful. It's a great molecule. We talked about that back in our organic molecules and biological macromolecules unit. Fat is wonderful because it stores a lot of energy. It's energy rich. So in the wild, fat storage is very, very important, especially for mammals that are living through the cold winters when food is scarce. So it definitely has an advantage in nature. But of course, in humans, we're not in the wild. We're in kind of a modern society, and so we can very quickly add fat and not ever use it, and that's where we can have problems with obesity. Again, if we are not maintaining proper balance. Well, a net loss of energy will result in a loss of mass, and so that's why the whole predication of diets is basically to try to get a net loss of energy, meaning if you eat fewer calories per day and increase your activity, well, you're going to lose weight. And so that's the equation for maintaining our body mass. It's really no trick to it. There are, of course, like fad diets that will try to help with this, but most of them, if you really study them closely, are all kind of based on decreasing caloric intake and increasing your basal metabolic rate. So whether it's the paleo diet or basically a carb-free diet, all of it really does kind of play off of this net loss of energy. So it's pretty interesting when you take a look at it at the basics of any diet that you're doing. So really, the secret to weight loss is just eating less and moving more, which is easier said than done, right? So especially in a modern world where we tend to be quite stationary, whether we're going to school or work or driving. Now, it is true, though, that your appetite and metabolism can change, and it is hormonally driven, right? So there is a set point for your diet, and so for your body, and you may run into this when you are trying to lose weight, especially if you're older, if you're trying to lose weight, your body will have a metabolic set point. Some of you may actually even already see this now, like you're trying to gain weight for whatever, maybe it's wrestling or something like that, and you try to have gains and you're eating more, but your body's just not putting on the weight or increasing mass. And that can happen because you have a homeostatic set point for your body mass. And so your body's like, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to kind of maintain this. So again, appetite and metabolism can change as a result of that, right? And it is hormonally driven, as I mentioned just a little bit ago. Let's look at the example of leptin. So again, in wild animals, there is this notion that if you have a lot of body mass, a high body mass, or a lot of adipose tissue stored, like this wolf at the end of winter here, or at the beginning of winter, I should say, has put on a lot of body mass to survive the winter, right? But now food is available. He's carrying too much weight, so the hormone leptin will be secreted into the blood. It's high, and the result is a control of the brain in the animal that will signal the decrease in appetite and increase in metabolic rate, right? Meaning he will want to eat less, and his body will burn fat more to shed that extra body mass that is no longer needed for the cold winter. Now, when winter is about to start, or at the end of winter, um, or excuse me, I'm getting that backwards. When winter is about to approach and the animal may be quite skinny because it's been active through the summer and running around, well, now leptin concentration will be low because the animal has too little body weight and too little adipose tissue, and therefore appetite will be stimulated and metabolic rate will decrease so that less energy is burned and the animal can start to store fat more. And so there has been some research looking into this tie to obesity in humans. Again, the game is much different for humans because we don't live in the wild. We're not ever going through a winter season where food availability is low. And so we tend to override our body's set points very easily with the availability of food and the unavailability of activity in our lives. Modern man is quite sedentary. We do not walk as much as we should, and the tendency is really to put on weight, especially as we get older. So it's something we have to be cognizant of as we get older, is to make sure that we are helping to maintain our body set point with this appropriate energy balance, whether that comes in the form of more exercise or an appropriate diet. Again, it's kind of like a user choice there. Now let's talk about food webs and the flow of energy through ecosystems. So to start out, we'll kind of talk about the basic of a food web, and that is the food chain, which is the linear depiction of, and you may, if I were to ask you to define this, you may say, well, this is a diagram of showing who eats who. And that is true, but more accurately, it's showing how energy is moving from one organism to another. Because when you feed on something, you're basically taking in its energy. That's why we measure food in its calories available to us. Each feeding level in a food chain is known as a trophic level. And autotrophs are organisms that are able to harvest light or chemical energy and store it as food in chemical and in carbon bonds. And so autotrophs tend to occupy, or don't tend to, they do occupy the first trophic level, which we call the primary producers. So this would include plants and phytoplankton and even macroscopic algae and seaweed, right? So those are all autotrophs. They're photosynthesizers, or in some ecosystems they may be chemosynthesizers, meaning they can actually they don't need light, but what they need is chemicals to harvest energy. Heterotrophs, such as ourselves, are organisms that eat other organisms. So we also can call these consumers, but notice there are many levels of consumers. There's the primary consumer, which we often will call herbivores because they are consuming the plants, or the primary producers. So notice the energy that's stored in plants will transfer up the food chain to the next feeding level known as the primary consumers. Secondary consumers are exclusively eating primary consumers. So again, the energy transfers up to the next trophic level. So this would be the third trophic level up, but the second level of consumers, known as secondary consumers. Third level consumers are known as tertiary consumers. So it's the fourth level, the fourth trophic level, but it is the third level of consumers here. And it will continue up. You can end up with quaternary consumers, but generally don't go much higher than that. We'll talk about why that is. Now, what's not represented here are what we call the detritivores or decomposers. This is another strategy for acquiring energy. They don't actively play a role in predator-prey relationships, which is why they're often excluded from food chains and food webs. But what they do is they eat detritus. Detritus is basically decomposing material. It could be dead leaves, it could be dead organisms, And so they are very common as well. They get their energy from all trophic levels because, for example, a detritivore like like a scavenging vulture, for example. Well, he could eat a dead snake or he could eat a dead lizard. He may even consume some caterpillars, right? So they'll eat from all of those levels. Now, decomposers like bacteria, for example, and mushrooms they absorb their food. They're not eating carrion or eating dead animals. But they actually absorb it. So such as mushrooms growing on a tree, they're absorbing the molecules from the tree that fell in the forest. So again, as we mentioned, they are extremely common in an ecosystem and need a large percentage of the total matter. But even though they're very common, they tend not to be represented in food chain diagrams and in food webs. And speaking of food webs, this is a great example of one. They are much more complex models because they're interconnected food chains. Because most of us here on this planet, don't really exist in a true food chain. We have feeding options. You can think of yourself as a human. When you eat a chicken sandwich, for example, well, of course, you're eating the chicken breast from the chicken animal itself, but you're also eating wheat, which comes to make the bread. You might be eating a lettuce and tomatoes. So there's a number of things that go into you eat a number of things. So you don't just eat one particular thing. And we see that represented here with this food web, right? So we can see that the cheetah, which is a tertiary consumer in this ecosystem, is known to feed on wildebeests and Thompson's gazelles, impalas, and also I think I'm following that all the way down to the hare, right? So that's what they will feed on. So there's multiple feeding options, and they're complex in nature. So we can see that's called a web because it quite honestly looks like a spider web when you draw the arrows. And the arrows, notice, are always pointing towards the consumer, but they also show us the flow of energy, right? So when a cheetah consumes a Thompson's gazelle, the energy that was stored in the gazelle is being consumed by the cheetah. Notice that detritivores are not pictured in this diagram. So they are absent because it's really hard to kind of incorporate them into this diagram. So it's just challenging, right? Because they eat at all levels, so they don't really fit into a typical food web diagram. But they're there, and they're very important for an ecosystem. Now, what's interesting is, notice there's not a quaternary consumer level or a fifth trophic level above the lion, the cheetah, and all these predators up here, because the second law of thermodynamics limits the number of trophic levels. And that's what we're going to take a look at next. Why is that? Why are there limited numbers of feeding levels in an ecosystem? Well, part of it has to do with the assimilation, or the total energy taken in by an organism for growth and cellular respiration. So we look at the squirrel here feeding on a nut. So there's basically 1,000 joules of energy that are stored in that nut that is consuming, right? It's consuming about 1,000 joules of energy. Joule is a unit of energy similar to calories, but they're not exactly equivalent, right? So we're not saying a peanut has 1,000 calories, or just a different unit here. But basically that squirrel is deriving 1,000 joules by consuming this peanut. Now, 16 of those joules will actually be incorporated into the biomass. We call that assimilation, right? About 807 joules will be used for cellular respiration, which basically is saying this is the animal's basal metabolic rate. It's going to be burned off. So basically 80% of the calories that are consumed here are being dissipated into the environment as a result of basal metabolic rate. And then, of course, about 200 joules, 177 joules, are going to be lost to the environment, to decomposers, by waste, feces, right? So what's interesting is he's eating this meal, but very little energy is going into the biomass of the organism. So this is also what we call net productivity, which is the energy that becomes biomass. Notice it's not 100% efficient, the energy transfer. The meal, not all of the meal is being incorporated into the body for its organism, right? And you guys know this, like you could eat like an entire pizza, that might have a couple of pounds, like, 2 pound large pizza. That doesn't mean you're going to wake up the next day and have 2 pounds of body mass on you. Additionally, what's going to happen is you might gain some weight from that depending on your basal metabolic rate and your activity levels. But, most of it is going to be used to make body heat. Some of it will be incorporated into your feces, your next bowel movement, and some of it will be incorporated into your body mass, right? So this is your basal metabolic rate. So there is this notion of trophic level energy efficiency, right? Which is the amount of energy in one trophic level that becomes the biomass in the next trophic level, right? So this is kind of like, we say this is like the 10% rule. So trophic level energy transfer is never 100% efficient. Because of the second law of thermodynamics, right? No energy transfer is 100% efficient. So this is typically only about 10% in ecosystems, although not exactly all the time, but it's just kind of typical. So that's why we say, you will probably, about 10% of the energy that you consume in your calories will actually be used for growth and activities that you need for the day, which is why if you ever look up your caloric requirements for your own personal diet, you'll see that bare minimum you need as many calories as 10 times your body mass. So like, for example, if you are 100 pounds, your basal metabolic rate requires that you eat about 1,000 calories a day. And that's just to maintain a body mass of 100 pounds. If you eat more than that, that means you'll have extra energy for running around and doing energy, and presumably also growth. If you eat less than that, then you either won't grow or you'll even lose body mass, right? So this is where the idea of diets and such come in. It has to do a lot with this efficiency of energy transfer. But what does this look like on an ecosystem level, right? Well, we have these ecological pyramids to show the distribution of energy between trophic levels. So within trophic levels or a food chain, energy is lost due to maintenance. So we can see this here in the example. We have 4 trophic levels here. We've got primary producers, our plants. They have the most energy. This is kilocalories per square meter per year. That's the amount of energy used, right? A lot. Then the herbivores, the insects and the snails, much less. The fish that consume the insect and the snails, even less. And the fish that consume those small fish, even less, right? Roughly, it's not exactly 10%, but you can kind of see how only 10%, roughly, a small percentage of the energy that's available in one trophic level makes it up to the others. So you can kind of visualize, well, what happens? Why is there not a 5th level up here? Well, you see that you have run out of energy. There's not enough energy to support another level of consumers in this particular ecosystem example. Now, if you run out of energy, well, then that also means that you will have a decrease in biomass and population, or numbers of individuals, as you go up through the trophic levels, right? So again, this here is looking at biomass, basically what we call the grams of living tissue per square meter. Very high in plants, much lower in herbivores, lower in primary or secondary consumers, and even lower in tertiary consumers, right? There's just very little biomass. And you see this in population too, right? If you look at a U.S. grassland here, this is the abundance of organisms per 1/10 of a hectare or 1/10 of an acre, right? Lots of grass, right? Millions of blades of grass and plants in this given area. Lots of insects, lots of mesopredators, predatory insects and such. Very few birds, right? Can't, and you understand this, right? This would be a very topsy-turvy ecosystem if in every acre you saw like one plant but a million birds. Like that wouldn't be a healthy ecosystem. That would be a horror movie, right? So you understand this conception or this concept here of basically that with a decrease in energy as you move up the trophic level, and you have this decrease in energy because of the second law of thermodynamics. Energy is lost due to inefficiency and maintenance of body tissue. And so basically it decreases. So if you have less energy at each trophic level, you'll have less biomass that has incorporated the energy available, and therefore fewer individuals as you go up the food chain. Gross primary productivity is looking at the amount of carbon fixed during photosynthesis, and this will help us to understand. So that's basically the total amount of energy that plants will incorporate into their body tissue. Now, an important question that we answered early on in the year when we looked at photosynthesis is, why do plants do photosynthesis? Well, they do this because they're making sugar for themselves. They need to have their own energy source to support the growth of their own body mass. So that's the gross primary production is really looking at the total energy they make as a result of photosynthesis. Net primary production is looking at the amount of energy left over after the plants do their respiration. So this is the gross productivity minus respiration. And so this is very similar to kind of like how a paycheck works, right? You have your gross pay, which is the amount of money you've earned from your salary, and then your net paycheck, which you actually get to take home, is basically your gross pay minus taxes and insurances and so forth. Net primary productivity is a very important measure in an ecosystem because this net productivity is what we're seeing depicted in these trophic pyramids, these ecological pyramids. It's the amount of energy available to the consumers. And that's what moves up the food chain and supports the structure of ecosystems. Just like the net pay that you bring home supports the consumable economy in an ecosystem. Yes, your taxes support the infrastructure, but the money that you get to take home, well, that goes into your bank account. That's what you can invest. That's what you can spend on food and recreation, and kind of drives the economy. So net primary productivity is kind of like that. It's what drives the interaction among ecosystems. Whereas the gross primary production is what supports the whole infrastructure. That's what allows plants to grow, and once plants grow, then your whole food chain will be stimulated. Primary productivity is not consistent on planet Earth, and it varies quite a bit. And let's take a look at how and why that varies. Well, primary productivity is limited because of the availability of energy. But there's also some limiting factors. So on land, and yes, light, is important, right? Light is a major driver of photosynthesis, as is water. But in terrestrial or land-based ecosystems, we tend to see that availability of light is not one of the major limiting factors. It is, in a sense, seasonally, especially up in northern stretches and the very extreme southern stretches, when during the winter there's less light and trees will shed their leaves. But when we talk about the availability of energy for food chains, the two major limiting factors on land-based terrestrial ecosystems is temperature and precipitation. And so those are what drive primary productivity. So it's no surprise that the area that has the highest productivity tends to be in tropical areas along the equator. There's always It's always consistently warm, and because of the atmospheric interactions, you have a consistent belt of rain around the equator that gives us our tropical biomes. So we have lush tropical rainforests like here in Brazil, and stretches of Indonesia, Central America. There's lots of rainforests that are present in these areas simply because there's so much rain and it's consistently warm. That's not to say you can't have good primary productivity up here in the forests of Canada and Russia, but that tends to be seasonal, right? During the winter, it'll be less. During the summer, it's very, very high. Now, aquatic and oceanic ecosystems have two different sets of limiting factors. Temperature doesn't limit productivity in the ocean, mostly because the ocean is a fairly consistent temperature. Yes, it's a little warmer at the equator and colder at the poles, but not to the degree that we see in the atmosphere. So ocean water tends to be consistently cooler and stable when compared to land-based ecosystems. Also, precipitation is not a concern for the ocean because it is in water, or even in a lake, because water availability is not a concern as it is if you're a plant growing on land and are requiring rain to fall out of the sky. So as a result of that, there's a different set of limiting factors for aquatic ecosystems, and that is sunlight and nutrients. So the availability of light is a big driver for productivity in the ocean, which means that limits productivity in oceans and lakes near the surface in what we call the photic zone. So there's plenty of light at the surface of the ocean, surface of lakes, that algae can use for photosynthesis. Nutrients are also very important. So nutrients are kind of like natural fertilizers. There tend to be nitrates and phosphates that really plants need. It's the macronutrients plants need for growth. Those tend to be fairly abundant on land in the soil, so they're not a limiting factor to the degree that temperature and precipitation is on land. But in the ocean, big driver in productivity, which now this explains why you can see one of the trends for productivity is you'll see there is a lot of productivity closer to coastlines. In particular, you see a lot of productivity on the western edge of coastlines and right here along the equator. If you've taken marine science or oceanography, you understand the reason for this is because there's these interesting currents along the western edge of coastlines known as upwelling. Upwelling are currents that well up or come up from the bottom of the ocean, and they deliver nutrients that have settled at the sea bottom. And so they deliver them up along the coast, very predominantly here along the coast of Peru and Ecuador. We see that over here in Africa as well. And so these and also on the west coast of the United States. And so lots of nutrients, lots of phytoplankton or algae, and therefore lots of fish. So these tend to also be your big, really good fishing grounds. The best fishing is where you see these upwelling currents. You'll also see upwelling is persistent along the equator. And again, that has to do with the atmospheric circulation and the currents in the ocean. The currents run into each other and drive. There's like this equatorial upwelling currents that bring the nutrients up to the surface. So again, when nutrient and sunlights are abundant at the surface, you have plenty of algae growing in the ocean, which stimulates productivity. This graphic here will kind of summarize the notion that energy flows. We're going to look at this model here showing you the flow of energy in a salt marsh in Georgia. All right, so we know, according to the first law of thermodynamics, the organisms that live in the salt marsh cannot create the energy. It must come from an outside source. In this case, it comes from sunlight. Now, the producers, the primary producers or the autotrophs in this ecosystem are Spartina and algae. And notice that they will capture about 6% of the incident solar radiation coming inland. So they don't even maximize 100% of the sun's efficiency, right? They just only use 6% of it. Now, they will, of course, do photosynthesis. Most of the energy that the plants are consuming or acquiring is used well, all of it is used for photosynthesis, but notice about 77.6% is used for the plant's own cellular respiration and growth, right? Remember that plants do photosynthesis primarily to supply their own needs for energy and growth. Now that means there's about 22.4% of the energy they harvested that can be used as net primary productivity. So notice the net primary productivity, which is stored in the body mass of the algae and plants itself, now is available for the rest of the food chain, right? It's net productivity. That's why we say it's a very important measure. How much energy is available for, well, your herbivores. Well, before we get to herbivores, we're going to get to decomposers and detritivores. So most plant algae material will die and become detritus, which is available for bacteria, right? So the decomposing plant material can be decomposed by bacteria, can be consumed by worms and crabs, and then the remainder is washed out to sea, which goes back to the previous slide. Another reason there's so many nutrients available along coastlines is because rivers and estuaries and salt marsh will provide an abundance of net productivity, and here the estimate is that 10% of it washes out into the ocean, which will stimulate primary productivity in food chains out in the ocean. So ecosystems tend to all be kind of connected like this, right? Well, now we've gone through, we've done the net productivity, we've done the decomposition and consumption of detritus. Now we can finally go back to our traditional food chain. Right now, where's the food chain? Well, notice only about 0.6% now goes to the insect herbivores, right? The true primary consumers in this food chain or food web. They will consume the plants and at a rate and only get about 0.6% of the energy that came in from the sun. Well, then notice, again, this is all because of the second law of thermodynamics. No energy transfer is 100% efficient, right? So only 0.1% of the energy that is in the herbivores will then make it to the carnivores like spiders, right? And so on and so forth. So again, this is a nice depiction of how energy flows through ecosystems. We see the demonstration of the first law of thermodynamics that energy can't be created, it must be harvested from the sun. And we see that no energy transfer is 100% efficient. And a lot of the energy is dissipated as heat into the environment by means of cellular respiration in plants and also other animals as well. Because primary productivity varies, the distribution of biomass is not even on planet Earth. So when we look at the global biomass, most of living things are plants. And that, of course, goes along with the models we saw with ecological pyramids, right? So they occupy the largest, most energy-rich trophic level in the food chain, right? So plants are the most abundant living things in terms of global biomass. Following them are bacteria, the decomposers, very prevalent in ecosystems. Followed by that would be fungi or fungus. Those are also very important decomposers. So no surprise that decomposers, bacteria and fungi, play a very, very large role in the global biomass of our planet. Archaeans are another type of prokaryote that can also be important decomposers. So again, when we look at decomposers in the total here, we can see that they are totaling about, my math is going to be, what was that, 91 gigatons of carbon globally. So quite a bit, right? So there's much more bacteria than animals. We'll get to that in a second. Protists would be next on the list, right? Unicellular algae and so forth, right? So those are a lot of those are protists, but some are like fungi, and some are animal-like. So they're a unique little group of unicellular organisms. So we haven't even really gotten into consumers yet, right? So we haven't gotten to that point yet. Here are our consumers. Animals, in comparison to plants and decomposers, are very minimal on our planet, right? So only about 2 gigatons of carbon in the global biomass. So animals are not a majority, right? Even though we tend to study them in great detail. There are far more plants and bacteria on this planet than animals. And coming in last would be viruses. As you suspect, they're so microscopic and very, very small, but yet even though they're so small, they play a very vital role, not necessarily in food chains, but in population control. If we focus in on the animals themselves, well, here we see even how rare it is to be a human. A couple interesting things here. We can see the most common animals are arthropods, making up roughly 50% of the global biomass of animals. So this would include insects and crustaceans and such. Fish are also really abundant. Fish are very numerous in lakes and oceans as well. And we can see worms and mollusks make up a big part. Cnidarians would be jellyfish, and unfortunately this level is growing because as we overfish the ocean, we're starting to see more cnidarians come into play and take over the ocean. Now, an interesting thing to note here is if we take a look at wild mammals and wild birds and add those numbers up, notice that the number of wild animals out there has less global biomass than our livestock, what we're raising on farms and such, right? And of course, here is humans. We make up a very, very small piece of the pie, but probably even more than we should, right? Because there's a lot of humans on this planet, and our population is soaring, growing very high. We'll talk a little bit more about population growth, but we tend to be very prevalent in the modern day compared to human populations in the past, and we're having an impact on the availability of biomass on this planet as seen by the number of wild animals compared to what we're housing on our farms.